Okay, so good afternoon. We are going to start with a chapter 4, that is from unit 4, that is interceptors. We have completed 3 chapters of this unit, starting with introduction to enterprise Java beans. And then we have completed 2 chapters where one chapter was talking about the first type of enterprise Java bean. That was your session beans, which is also consisting of 3 subtypes, that is stateless, stateful, and singleton. And then third chapter was talking about the second type, that is your message driven bean. Okay, now the chapter 4 is going to be interceptors. Now we have to understand basically what interceptors are. So in detail, first of all, I'll just give you the brief introduction of this topic and then we'll go in detail. So let's assume that we have one EJB file, okay, which consists of a Java code, obviously, and then in that EJB file, you can consider that you have created 4 to 5 classes, okay, and before that 4 to 5 classes, you have created one interceptor class, okay. Now that interceptor class is nothing but it's again a normal Java class, okay. Now that interceptor class is going to help for number of things to deal with those classes which are created after interceptors. One, it can help you to validate the parameters which can come from the client as in the form of a request. Okay, so for example, I have an EJB file which is been considered as a server side file. There will be the another file which can consider as a client file, that means that can be generated or developed using maybe the HTML or JSP or JavaScript. So from there, when the inputs come, from where the request generates for the server side application. Now, what is the job of the server side application? To accept those requests and those inputs which comes from the client and process it. Okay. So while processing, we can implement one thing in between that client's request and the server code, what we have written in EJB, we can place one thing in between that is called as something interceptors. So what interceptor is going to do is it is not going to allow to those requests which comes from the client to invoke the methods which has been written inside the EJB file in the normal classes which has been written even like after your interceptors. Okay, so now interceptor is like providing you can say uh, a protection to those methods which needs to be invoked. Okay, many logics we have been written in the methods of the normal classes, and based on the request of the client which can come, we have written the processing code into those methods. Okay, so whenever request comes as per the requirement and the requested thing, the respective method gets invoked in your EJB file, or you can say in the server side files. Okay, to make to have that assurity that invalid requests should not reach to the normal classes where methods are being written and the logic has been written into those methods. So what we can do is interceptor will first check those parameters, those requests. Okay, and if it is invalidated, if it is not correct, so from there only it is going to not going to accept those requests. Okay, so it will not make the request to reach to those methods where the actual logic has been written for the processing of your server files, okay, or processing of your request which comes from your client. Fine. So I hope this brief introduction you have understood that what interceptors are and why it is being used. Okay, now that's why it is called as the interceptor is an add-on functionality to the EJB, that is your enterprise Java bean, which works for the methods without modifying the method specification, without modifying the method codes, okay, without modifying the logic which has written inside the method. Fine. Now interceptor can be used for, as I told you, it can be used for validating the parameter. So before they pass it to the actual method which is responsible for processing those requests which comes from client, so it will validate first and then only it is going to pass it to those methods. It will also perform the security checks at the time when the business method is being called by the request. Okay, also it is going to maintain the log application operations. Now the next one, request and the interceptor. So whenever the request has been received by the interceptor, what is going to happen? What interceptor can do basically when it when it receives that request? from the client. So it can ignore that request because it can be possible, it is not a valid parameter which is came from the client. So it can ignore that request. It will not make the request to reach to the methods for the invocation. It can also act on the request. That means maybe there is a valid parameter, which the client has sent. So there is an option that it is going to act on it, and it is going to forward it to the methods where it can invoke and process the request. It can also prevent the EJB classes method from firing. So as I told you, like, it is not going to allow to the request until and unless it is following certain criteria, some rules been done by the interceptor. So that validity, that security check needs to be done by the interceptor. That is what we are implementing in between your request and the other class code or a custom logic what we are going to write inside the EJB file, okay, where the methods are been written. So it will prevent that, to have that firing, or you can have the invocation of the method. We can prevent that. Now the interceptors are going to deal with EJB. As we all know that enterprise Java bean, it is like consisting of one of the add-on functionality, that is something called as an interceptors. uh, so when we are going to decide that we want to implement an interceptors, because it is providing some good features to the developers to make the methods and the logics what they are writing, that is like they can be safe from the request which can come from the client. So if I can give you an example, say, I am having a server side files, I have a client side file. The client, when I'm going to request, so the client is not every time necessarily it's a genuine client. It can be an hacker, it can be the some a third party who wants to interpret your message of your genuine user, and it can send the request to the server on behalf of him. Okay, so at that time it's not necessary that, basically the attackers never send the data or the valid data at one go. They try the combinations and permutations, based on the data what they have about the user. So not possible that every time it is going to give the valid parameters. Possibly they can have multiple invalid parameters to reach to one valid parameter, so that they can get an access to the server. Okay, so basically all the like whatever interceptors we are going to create, so it is going to deal with all the EJB classes. So you can just say that, very first class will be your interceptor class, and the rest of the classes what you're creating is those classes where the actual business logics have been written. Okay, so the interceptors needs to have the full access to all those classes which needs to be getting executed, as well as where all the variables and the methods are being created, where the execution is going to happen when the request is going to come. The methods are been written which needs to be invoked by those requests. So it needs to have all the access to those all variables and the fields. Okay, if you are not giving to any specific particular class, the access to the interceptor. So if the request comes from the the client, and the interceptor is not having the control over one particular class, and the request which came, it is for that class only of where the method has been written. So this all thing, valid parameter checking, security checking, is not going to happen. Fine. Now, defining an interceptor, I told you why it is being used. Basically, it is going to intercept your method or a lifecycle event. So whenever you're going to start with an execution of your program, in the application, obviously, there is going to be a client file, there's going to be a server file. So we create a client file using HTML and JSP. We create the server side file using maybe the servlet, or maybe using the JSP also for smaller application, or the from using the EJB also. So there, once the execution start, which you can say that, the life cycle event basically. So when it starts executing the line by line, the whole, the logic what you have written, that also can be, had a control by the interceptor. Also it can had a control over the methods of the classes what you have created. Now to do this and to make it possible, we have one annotation. In the previous lectures, I gave you the brief, or you can say the detailed introduction about the annotation as well as the dependency injection. So the annotation is always going to be, written in your program, where you're going to start with the name, with the @ sign. Okay. So there basically you need to have an interceptor in your program. So here, to intercept the methods of your classes by an interceptor, you need one method, or you can say one annotation, that is something called as what, @around invoke annotation. If you write this annotation in your program, so that means you are making sure to your classes that your methods of those classes are going to be invoked with the help of the interceptors only. Fine. What interceptor methods can, like can be defined for? It is defined for the enterprise bean classes. It is also defined for the interceptor classes. And as I told you, it's nothing but it's a normal Java class file, the interceptor class. Now, at around invoke method, it can be defined by either of the following methods. You can write directly at the rate around invoke annotation in the program. Okay, we'll be like having one program at the end of this chapter, so don't worry about it, how to use it and all those things. We can have the annotation at the rate around invoke directly writing into the logic. Okay, or else we can make like similar kind of an element. We can use similar kind of an element in the file called as a deployment descriptor. So if you remember what do you mean by deployment descriptor, it's something called as an XML file. Okay, so all the XML file in, at least in Java, is something called as an deployment descriptor, where you can have number of, lot of information, maybe the navigation information, mapping information from one file to the another file, and what you have used it from, which client file needs to, meet to the first, maybe it is an interceptor, and then interceptor needs to redirect it to the other classes. All these informations are given in the deployment descriptor. Okay, now I told you either you can use at the rate around invoke annotation in your program directly, or else you can have certain elements which you can write, like your around invoke annotation. There will be certain elements which you can write inside your XML file, okay, of your EJB. So EJB jar.xml is a deployment descriptor of your EJB. Similarly, like we had for servlet, that is your web.xml. Okay, so like for your servlet web.xml, similarly for EJB, we have EJB jar.xml file, which is considered as your deployment descriptor. Fine. Now, around invoke method must satisfy the following requirements. Basically, it must be allowed for, it must have the whole access to all the classes which you are going to create inside your EJB file. It should be having the public constructor, but it should be default constructor. There's no need of having any argument. Third thing, from where you're going to get this interceptor, you need a package that is something called as javax.interceptor.star. If you want to have a class, if I just talk about the class which you require for having the interceptor in your program, that is something called as invocation context. Okay, so basically the similar way you are going to have an instance or an object for your normal classes, that object and instances are being created basically by the web container or the Java beans, okay, for that specific file. Similarly, here also the EJB container is going to create an object or an instance whenever you're going to have an interceptor. So there is requirement of an object which we are going to, identify your interceptors. Your basically Java bean wants to identify your interceptor, so they create an object. So now for creating an object, there is a requirement of a class. Okay, so for interceptor, we have a class called as an invocation context. Okay, it can throw an application exception also, runtime exception also. We can define the exception in the interceptors, that is allowed. The interceptor can be declared as a private, public, and protected. Now, the last thing which you have to know that about the around invoke, that invocation context is a class which is consisting of one method called as a proceed method. Okay, so that method is going to give you a hint or a signal, not basically you, but the program, the code what you have written. Okay, it is going to give a signal to the code, to the logic, to continue with the invocation of a method. Now we'll have certain annotations. We'll see one by one. We'll have the two annotation, that is something called as the around invoke and around timeout. So basically it comes from the first package, that is the javax.interceptor.star. Okay. Around invoke, we have learned in detail that why it is been used. If you want to invoke a method of a class, we need to write at the rate around invoke annotation. Around timeout is basically meant for, you can decide the timer basically. Okay, that till the time you are going to invoke a method, that timer you can decide it. Fine. Then we have the another two annotation which comes from the different packages, that is annotation.star, that is javax.annotation.star. So one is post construct, one is your pre-destroy. So when I talk about the post construct, we have already learned about this particular annotation at the rate post construct. So when I talk about the life cycle also, basically first thing is what your object creation or an instance creation. And after that, if you want to make the whole life cycle to be getting executed, So you need to write inside @post construct. So basically the main business logic what you are going to write is going to be written inside your post construct. And then we are going to use the another annotation, that is what, pre-destroy, that is meant for the garbage collection. Now it's just a brief what we have learned just now, interceptor classes. So as I told you, the javax.interceptor.star is the package from where you can get an class that is something called as an invocation context, which is meant for the interceptor. Okay, and from that we have the method called as proceed, which is going to help us to give a signal to have a continue, to continue with the invocation of a method. Also, if I want to implement the annotation in my program, so what I can do is I have to implement, or I have to import a package called as javax.interceptor.interceptor. Okay, so if you want to implement, or if you want to write an annotation in your program, you can have an interceptor as a class. Fine. Now the class must have a public, like it can be public, but it is should not be having any constructor into the, no argument into the constructor. It should be default constructor. Okay. Now the class can have any number of interceptor classes. That means one EJB file can have any number of interceptor classes, any number of other classes also. You can assign one interceptor class to one class methods. You can have the another interceptor class to the another class or its methods. Like that way you can do it. Okay. We have learned about the concept called as dependency injection. Here it is only one problem is going to occur. If I am going to have an interceptor class and the dependency injection together in one program, so the dependency injection is going to create, you can say, it is not going to make allow the interceptor to work the way it is meant to work. Okay, so it is going to stop that. So dependency injection basically going to allow the request to communicate directly with the target class, to whichever class it wants to communicate. So it can allow by creating an instance, class instance, and dependency injection will make the client to communicate with the targeted class where the method has been written. And as per the request is accessing the method, it will allow directly, it will ignore the interceptors. Okay. Now interceptor lifecycle, it's very easy. First is, it's like almost similar to the other life cycles what we have learned. So we are going to have a target class, or you can say the normal classes what we have written after the interceptor class. Okay, so we need to create an object of the target class. Basically not the developers, but the Java beans or the EJB container is going to create that instance. We need to have an object for the interceptor class also. Okay, then we need to have a post construct annotation @post construct. As I told you, the target class is going to work, or the logic for the target class needs to be written after your annotation called as @post construct. Okay, then we'll have it @pre-destroy, which is something been called for the garbage collection. Now interceptor methods can be applied into three levels, like in the form of a three levels. So we'll have a default level interceptor. In this, basically whenever the method is going to be invoked, so whatever things we need to write for invoking those methods using an interceptor, we need to write it within the deployment descriptor file. Okay, I hope I'm clear what I just said. The default level interceptor is something you are not going to use any type of an annotation, but you are going to write a element which is going to be written inside your deployment descriptor. That is something, an XML file of your EJB, that is your EJB jar.xml. There you need to write an element or a code for having this interceptor to work. Okay, let the interceptor to invoke, but you have to write it within the deployment descriptor. Okay, class level interceptor is something where you are being allowed to invoke for every method of the class. So that means basic, if in a Java file, if I am having, if an EJB file, if I'm having 5 classes and I have written, say for example, 5 methods inside those classes, so I'll be having a class level interceptor which is written inside the class, not inside the deployment descriptor. So there it is allowed to invoke each and every method what you have written for all the classes. Okay, you have both the options. Either you can go with the annotation as I just told you, maybe around invoke annotation you can use, or you can directly go with the XML file, that is your jar.xml file. Next is what your method level interceptor, that is been invoked for a particular method. That means you'll be very much specific with your interceptor, that which method of which class you want to invoke. So that you can also do with the help of an annotation, or else you can go with the XML file. But the only first one, default one, you cannot write something anything in your class, in your files like your EJB file. You need to have, in the XML file only. This is your life cycle. So once we are going to create, we are going to start with this. So we'll have an around invoke method. So first this is going to happen. Once the around invoke method is going to have, we'll need to have, two things, maybe post construct and around construct. So creation or invocation of a method depends on the annotation what you have used. So if you want that, the invocation should happen before the creation, then you can go with the @around construct. If you want, let the creation happen first, the method creation, and then you can start invocation. Okay, so then you can use @post construct. Fine. And then lastly it comes your pre-destroy. So then after all these things happens, creation and the invocation, then you'll have a pre-destroy, that is your uh, Java, or you can say garbage collection. Now before they are going to be like constructed, or you can say the methods are constructed. If you want to have the creation, then you can have @around construct. Once it is constructed, you need to execute the business logic, then you can have a @post construct. If you want to have a method invocation, you can go with the around invoke method. If you want to have a garbage collection, go with the pre-destroy. If you want to set a timeout for the EJB, then we can have an @timeout. Now this is the last thing which we have to study today, that is one example. So here we are going to have two files. Okay, one file is going to have some methods. We are going to invoke those methods into the Java file or an EJB file, where I am going to even create the interceptors. Okay, and those interceptors are going to invoke these methods. Okay, now what we are doing, we are having two packages. One is java.util.star, because we want one class something called as a list. Then we'll have an javax.ejb.star. Now in this EJB, we are going to call an annotation. That annotation name is what? Remote. Fine. Why we want a remote annotation over here? Basically, so as I told you, we'll be having two different Java files. Okay, this library being remote.java, and there will be the another file that is also a Java file. So to make that communicate one Java file to the another Java file, obviously they are going to communicate over the network. They're going to communicate remotely. So we need to mention that we are going to have a remote connection with the other file to which we are going to refer to. Okay, so we are going to write @remote. Fine. So for that need, we need this package, and we need this package util.star, because we want to have a list. And why we are using this list class, we'll come to know in future. Okay, now I hope you have understood these three lines. We'll be having an interface. We are creating an interface. Interface name is what? Library being remote. Okay, and in this interface, as I think everybody knows what interface is, it's a predefined abstract class. So if you have remembered the abstract class and the interface difference, okay, when I talk about the abstract class, we need to define the abstract keyword to the class before the class name. Also, we need to create an abstract method with a keyword called as an abstract. Okay, but when we, and that was a user defined abstract class. But if you want to have a predefined abstract class, we can go with the interface. Okay, and what is the syntax? Interface name. And inside the interface, we can write a methods. We don't need to give the abstract keyword. Okay, compiler will automatically understand by seeing the keyword what you have used while creating an interface. Okay, now there was another thing which we should remember, that in the abstract class, user defined abstract class, and the interface, whatever methods we are going to write, will not be writing the implementation of those methods. Okay, we'll be calling those methods into some other place, and then we'll be having an implementation. Fine. So similarly, what we have done, we have created two methods over here. One is your add book method, and there we have passed one string variable. Expectation is that we are going to have the different names of the book, which we are going to accept it, and we are going to add it into the list. And once we have added into the list, we just wanted to see what all books we have added, that we can fetch with the help of a get books method. Okay, these two methods are the user defined method. Now here we have added a data type called as a void. Okay, here, but we have added what we are going to get in return when we are going to invoke this get books method. So whatever we are going to get, we want in the form of a list. Okay, we want in the form of an ordered collection in the form which we have received it from the user. We need it in the same manner, in the same order, when we are going to invoke a get books method. Okay, and that list is going to provide you that option. So list basically can have a null values also, if you don't know. Okay, it can have a duplicate values also, like the values can be same, the name of the books can be same, as you can you can say that. The only thing which list is not going to provide is that is dynamic growth of an size of an list. Okay, once you have decided a list size, then it is not going to allow you to add it more. Now, need to have two terms, array list and the list. You can say that array list is the parent class and the list is the child class. List needs to be it needs to you can say override, or you can say the implements the list interface, or you can say these apps. Array list basically it is a class which is going to extend, it is going to inherit one of the class called as abstract list, and it is going to implement the list interface. Okay, again the array list is going to give you the dynamic the grow as per the need of the customer or a user, but then list is not going to do that. List is going to have an index based methods for inserting, deleting, collection, or you can say the updating, searching of the elements. It is also there in the array list also. Fine, the only thing is that the dynamic grows which is required is there in the array list. Now, we have learned about the first file. What we have done in the first file, we have created two methods inside one of the interface, and we have not written any implementation because it is not, it is by rule, it's not having any type of an implementation. So we'll have those methods. We'll be calling those methods over here in this in this file what we are creating with a name called as library bean.java. So again, we'll have a util.star because we need array list and list. We need the EJB because we want to use an annotation called as @stateless. Okay, there we had used this package to use an annotation called as @remote because the the files are separately located, so we need a remote connection with those files to which we want to communicate to. Okay, so next is what your interceptor dot interceptors, because we want to use the annotation, and allowing the annotation to be used in a file, in a Java file, we need this package. Okay, now we had started with this interceptors annotation. So we just said that we want to use an interceptor in this class. So very first thing what we are saying, we need an interceptors. Okay, and we are writing business interceptor dot class, which means that these interceptors what we are writing over here, this annotation is going to have the whole access to all those classes what we have created. Fine. Next annotation is what? @stateless. That means it is the file, it is the code which is not going to maintain any state between the conversation or between the client and the server. The conversation which will happen will not be maintained. Now, once the interceptor is created, I told you the first thing is interceptor needs to be created, and then you are going to create a class. Okay, and once you have said that it is going to have the whole access to all those classes what we are creating, so whichever class you're going to create after this will be handled by your interceptors. Now we have created a class called as what? Library bean. We are going to implement. So basically the file what we have created previously, or the interface name was what? Library bean remote. Okay, that was an interface. That's why we are using the keyword called as an implements. If it was a class, then we would have used extends keyword. Okay, now here what we are doing, we are creating a list again, and we are trying to get the values in the form of a string values. For that we are creating a variable. Okay, now we have a constructor. As I told you, the constructor needs to be default constructor of a class, needs not to have an argument. So it's a default constructor, we are following that. After that, what we are going to do is we are just going to add the data what we are going to get from the method called as add book. So what we are saying, basically we are just like if you remember in the abstract class and the interface, what we used to do, we used to write the methods, we will not write the implement. We need to override those methods into the main classes. Okay, in the rest of the classes where we want to make use of those methods. So those methods we can call and we have to override. There is no option available that we can ignore it. if we have created an interface and we have a methods, we need to override it compulsorily into the immediate classes what we are going to create it. Okay, so the immediate class was a library bean, so we need to invoke the method called as add book method, which we need to override basically from the previous interface, and we have written as it is what we have written in the interface. Now what we are saying, take the values of this. Okay, we are going to try to add the name of the book, which is going to come in the form of a string value. It is been added by using the method called as add book method, and it is been taking that values, the values which is going to hold by this variable book name. Okay, it is going to be added. So now this add method is a predefined method. This add book method is not a predefined, it's a user defined method. Okay, so you have the list class, which is consisting of a method called as add method to add the items into the list. Okay, now what I'm going to do, I'm going to get one by one all the books name. I'm going to use an add method to add into the list what I have created over here with the name called as bookshelf. Fine. Once I have added all the name of the books into the list by using an add method, which takes a value in the form of string values, then I'm just going to invoke a get books method. Okay, and it is been invoking with the help of a list, because list is considering consisting of all those values. Okay, it is going to return to me all those values what I'm going to fetch with the help of a get books method. Fine. So this is how your program is going to be there for the interceptor. Only thing which you have to remember is that whatever class you're going to create, you need to have an interceptors before of that. Then only it is going to have a control over your class. So here the interceptor is going to take a request from the interface file only when it is valid. Okay, when it is correct to interact with this file called as library.bin.java. Okay, so I'll stop sharing here. We are done with this chapter, students. Okay, so I don't know how many of you know